Okay, thank you so much for your patience. We have two other speakers, and then we'll open up for questions. I'm very, very happy to present our next speaker, who is originally from Zimbabwe, but is joining us today from Dubai. Vimbai Hungwe is a Chief Operating Officer of ADG Legal. She brings a wealth of experience and leadership to the firm. Prior to joining ADG Legal, she worked as Head of Operation at Astro Labs, where she advised and mentored startups through real legal and financial processes. She also managed the day-to-day of operations of the hub, including recruitment and designing and teaching classes in finance. Vimbai has also, and this is very interesting to those of you who visited the UAE, has been the headed the finance operations of Kareem for several years. She played an instrumental part in them becoming the first tech company from the Middle East to reach 1 billion valuation. Vimbai, please.
Good morning, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here to talk about Africa. As Shiri said, I am originally from Zimbabwe, but I have immense love for the continent, which has sort of brought me to where I am, despite my background in tech. So the do's and don'ts of promotion in Africa. So why Africa? I mean, as many of the panelists have already mentioned, we are a continent with immense potential. You know, the youngest population, we have all of the minerals you can think about. If we really were to work together, we could be self-sufficient and not really rely on anyone else. So youthful demographic, consumption is set to grow, the middle class is growing. The demand, if you're looking at it commercially, is only going to go up. So what are the challenges? One of our biggest challenges is actually the lack of industrialization. You know, most of our exports are actually raw materials. So when you look at the world and you look at how much trade is going on, how much people are exporting and importing, we fall into the minute category, I think, of what's important. As a continent, we also do not trade very much with each other. So as you know, for most countries, your biggest trading partners are usually your neighbors because you share borders. A lot of the times you have, you know, family members on either side. You understand each other. The demands will be the same. The demographics are the same. But for multiple reasons, which we'll get into, that's not the case in Africa at the minute. So inadequate financial resources, I think everyone has sort of touched on that. We have poor infrastructure networks, so be it roads, rail, if we look at telecoms, if we look at energy, which is one of our biggest issues. We also have a lot of disruptions. I think we had a solid sort of 10 years of virtual stability for a while there. And then in the last 2 to 3 years, you know, we've had a lot of crises sort of hit different countries, different regions. We're going through a lot of changes at the minute. There's a limited implementation of policies. So one of the things everyone is very good at is sitting at conferences like this, saying all the things we should do, doing all of the studies, doing the write-ups. You know, we all congratulate ourselves, give ourselves a pat on the back. But no one really thinks what is going to happen after the fact. You know, we know what needs to be done. How do we do it? How do we make it happen? And how do we support all these African countries to get it done? So for me, when I look at all of our issues, I think, you know, the sort of infrastructure deficit is what's holding us back. There's the Development Bank of South Africa in 2019, and I know this number has grown, but in 2019, we were running at an infrastructure deficit of between 130 billion and 170 billion a year. This is infrastructure that, for the population that is coming, if we are to be ready for all of the young people, you know, this is roads, this is schools, this is hospitals, electricity, all of that. We should be spending between 130 and 170 billion more than we currently receive at the moment. So these are some of the challenges that we face as a continent. Now, what are the opportunities? So we're here today to discuss what the opportunities are and what we can all do to kind of move the continent forward and actually have mutually beneficial relationships. So energy, in order for anyone to develop, energy I think is the backbone. Because if we don't have electricity, we can't have factories, we can't mechanize our agriculture, we can't really develop tech, et cetera, et cetera. Transportation and logistics. So again, we've all been speaking about the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which is a fantastic initiative for all of us. But how do we actually start moving goods across the continent within regional blocks when we don't have enough roads? So that's a big focus in terms of opportunities. And what's really interesting is a lot of African governments are actually starting to open up to kind of the toll system. Traditionally, that hasn't really been a thing for us. The government has had to fund roads from their own budgets, but there's now this realization that, look, you can open up to the world, let people with the expertise come in, charge people to use the better roads, and people are actually usually willing to pay for it. Telecoms. Again, penetration is very low in terms of telecommunications. There's massive opportunities. So telecoms actually goes hand in hand, I think, with the financial inclusivity that was spoken about. Because, most of the continent is unbanked, but wherever people can get a phone signal, everybody has a mobile phone. So what does that tell us? It means if we had more people, if we gave more people access, they could then be brought into the financial system through using their phones. So I'm from Zimbabwe. I know a whole generation of people who've never had a bank account, don't know what it is. The reason for that is we have something called EcoCash, which is mobile money. So EcoCash now probably processes 60% of all of the transactions in the country. People get their salaries through it, you pay your bills through it, you send money to each other, supermarket, toll fees, you name it, all of it is done through your mobile phone. And if we were to kind of strengthen that across the continent, then we have a way of leapfrogging in many ways. I hate dealing with banks, they're antiquated, it's painful. But if you have a phone and everything happens for you on that phone, it makes it much easier to bring people in. And then technology is another opportunity. So as I'm sure most of you know, there's been very little penetration in terms of technology. Agriculture is still one of the biggest sectors across the continent for all of the economies. Most of it is subsistence agriculture, so it's families working, the small piece of land that they have. If they have some extra, then they sell it. Now, what does this mean? Most of the world is actually struggling to figure out this kind of food security problem. We have land, we have good soils, we have water. What we don't have is the technology to actually enable us to become net exporters of food. It's incredibly sad that we actually still import a lot of it, but that's down to the lack of technology in the different sectors. And I think agriculture would be the first step. Then beyond agriculture, we can then start looking at value addition, going into manufacturing. And then beyond that, this young population we have, most of them are incredibly well educated. So everyone is primed to sort of start looking at the services sector in terms of growth and providing jobs for the future. Now, if we look at what's currently happening in the world, everyone is talking about sustainability, about going green. What do? We are actually, as a continent, emerging as one of the most crucial suppliers for this new revolution. The DRC is the real Wakanda for any of you that have actually watched that movie. They have absolutely everything that we need, but the challenges they face is around some of the things that we mentioned, like infrastructure, how to get things in and out, etc. And if we're actually going to be serious about revolutionizing our economies and becoming more green, we need to support countries like the DRC to be able to produce these things better. So what is it that we need to do? The panelists before me have done a fantastic job in sort of talking about what the areas we should be focusing on. But I'm going to speak from an African perspective. So trade policy and regulations. as I said, a lot of people have done studies, there's been meetings, all of it, but what I think is lacking is sort of the in-country support. So which is why it's exciting when you hear about stuff that like Mashav does, where they actually send in experts to say, okay, you guys are thinking about doing this. How do we actually support you to make this happen and do it in a practical way? Trade infrastructure. Again, if you want to be able to import anything into Africa or export it out, we need to be able to move the goods in an efficient manner. The way things currently work is suboptimal, if I'm being generous. You have places in like some border crossings, like between Zambia and the DRC, where you have 120 kilometers of trucks queuing up on either side of the border, to go in and out. So developing roads, developing ports, developing the backbone in terms of infrastructure to facilitate trade are some of the things that I think, as countries that want to help and support, these are the things we could look at. Now, productive capacity. As I said before, we are primed to be able to actually supply the world with a lot of what it needs. The gap currently is in the capacity space. And if we work with countries that have the expertise or can send us the expertise, and I love the exchanges that are happening that sort of empower people to go back home and be able to implement this, it's another easy win. And in terms of relationships and actually developing, having more impactful kind of relationships, I would definitely encourage that. And then trade-related adjustments. So there's always this tendency for everyone, I'm looking at the IMF in particular, to come into Africa and tell us what we need to do. You can't have these tariffs. We allow everybody to import whatever it is with no real rules. They encourage us to drop barriers. But on the other side of it, everyone else is still protectionist. Europe is paying ridiculous amounts of subsidies to their farmers. They're protecting them. We could go on, but basically what we need to look at is what is a fairer way of actually implementing some of these things, and what do our economies need? Because it's easy to sit on the other side of the table and say, well, if you did A, B, C, and D, it's good for you. But if you don't understand the context within the countries that you're trying to help, you end up doing more harm than good. And it's really important, I think, especially as academics and policymakers, to start working more closely with people in country. We have a lot of fantastic academics, a lot of our own research institutes. And I think if we're to make meaningful changes, it would be working alongside them instead of sort of coming in and lecturing this top-down approach, which clearly has created more harm than good. So I'm going to give you a practical example of some of the things that I have mentioned. So I'm going to talk about a project I've actually been working on myself with Meritus Development, which is basically will end up supporting 4 countries. So Lake Tanganyika is the second largest lake in the world, the second deepest too, for those of you that are geography nerds. And it's 670 kilometers top to bottom, right? Anywhere else in the world, this would be chock full of boats going up and down, moving goods, moving people, you name it. But for reasons that we'll go into, that's not what's happening. So there's a lot of trade actually that happens amongst the 4 countries that are there. So we're talking about the DRC. If we look at this map, the DRC would sort of be the western side of the map. Tanzania is on the other side. There's Zambia at the bottom, and there's Burundi at the top. And from Burundi, you actually then connect to Rwanda. Zambia, which is at the bottom of this lake, is the largest supplier of sugar into the Great Lakes region at the top. So Burundi and Rwanda and beyond. Zam Sugar currently sends most of the sugar that they send via trucks that take 2.5 to 3 weeks to get the sugar up there. Meanwhile, this lake sits there. On the Congolese side, which is even more fascinating, the goods that you get in Kalemi will probably be 4 times the cost of what you would pay everywhere else in the continent. So this broken logistics chain that we have actually has real impact for everyday people on the ground. So as an example, If you go into a shop in Kalemi, you are going to be paying about $3.50 a liter for milk. The same milk, if you are in Zambia or in Tanzania, you're looking to 89-ish cents maximum. But because trucks spend weeks on end on the road, they're stuck at these borders, demurrage, fuel, you name it. By the time the goods land in the DRC, the people of the Congo are paying 3 to 4 times what they should be for basic goods. So this goes back to the facilitating trade that we spoke of. So one of the idea that we came up with for solving some of these problems, and I'll give you a bit of background about why it hasn't been working, is creating what we're calling the Lake Tanganyika Shipping Company. So this lake has had, at the minute actually, there's no container shipping service that exists. The largest vessel on Lake Tanganyika is the MV Liemba, which was built by the Germans in 1918. It was sunk during the war. It's actually been sunk twice, during the First World War and the Second World War. They brought it back up, they fixed it up. It still works, but now it is sort of half decommissioned. So it actually does a lot of the relief work. So when war breaks out in the Eastern Congo, for example, which happened a little while ago, they will actually use that vessel to move tents in, to move goods, to move food, etc. The reason no one has actually built a proper vessel on this lake is because there's 4 countries involved. 4 countries, 4 different ports, 4 different states of repair. And again, we all love a good study. The EU has paid for a study, $1.2 million, I think they spent on it. The Japanese have paid for another one on the Burundian side. But the long and short of it is all of the studies have come back to one conclusion, which is we need to upgrade the ports. $6 or so billion is how much it would take to upgrade all of them. So what we did is we flipped that problem on its head and said, well, getting 4 countries to coordinate and to raise that sort of money is difficult. So we built a vessel that essentially works as a floating port. So it has its own crane, it can move containers, the state of repair of the different countries' facilities don't matter, but essentially what we will do is we will help them trade with each other. So the guys in Tanzania can now send containers of rice and food and everything else across the lake. The sugar company in Zambia will now be able to easily send things, up to Bujumbura without as much cost as they currently used to. These are the sorts of solutions which I think will go a long way in sort of helping us, but then comes the frustration. So this is just a bit of background about the countries that we will serve and the sort of impact that will be there. But my personal frustration on working on these projects is I think it ticks a lot of the boxes if we look at, when everyone talks about trade and development, but it's very difficult to actually get the money for it. So everyone talks a big game about, yes, we want to support Africa, yes, we've got money set aside. A lot of the DFIs will tell you we don't have any bankable projects. And then when you speak to them, you understand why no one is getting through. So we'll go back to that on this. So what's not to do, because this is supposed to be the do's and don'ts. It is not helpful to keep on encouraging us to export raw materials, for everyone to be scrambling to be getting, unprocessed lithium, unprocessed ores. What we really need to be doing is looking at all of the individual countries and figuring out how we can do, even to start off with just a little bit of value addition, building that into the policies I think is incredibly important and helpful at this point. Infrastructure. There's a big push, to get everybody to move away from coal at the minute. So this is one of the examples of things that are not helpful. So South Africa has an immense amount of coal. They have been discouraged and incentivized to move away from coal. However, anyone who knows the situation there knows there have been power cuts, industry has suffered, a lot of things have gone backwards. But what really annoys me is all of the coal that South Africa is producing is now being exported to Germany, who are at the forefront of telling us that we shouldn't be using coal. I think as a continent, we right now have an imperative to develop I think that should be our first priority. There are countries that have technologies that can help us clean up how we produce this energy. But I think for us, we need support in how we actually do what we need to do, but do it in a more sustainable and cleaner way. Productive capacity. So this is another pet peeve of mine. So when I said it's impossible to get the DFIs to really understand the problems on the ground, they all have these lists of requirements that work for a first world country, right? So for example, for me to actually understand the problems on Lake Tanganyika, I have physically had to go to every country and physically visit every port to understand the vessel that we needed to build. If you go online and look up what does the port of Bujumbura look like, you get very little information. No one tells you about the quayside, no one tells you about the depth, no one, so what we have is we do not have data, but the opportunities are there, and we just need to sort of start looking at things more creatively. It might be as, going as far down as actually hiring people to go on the ground to get the information that you need. But the problem we have right now is everyone sits there on their, behind their desks at their computers and makes decisions about things that you won't understand unless you've been on the ground. So it's looking at things differently. And then the trade-related adjustments. I think where possible to actually help us grow and help us figure out our exports, we need to start looking at these tariffs in a serious way. Is it really necessary to put tariffs on a country that, like I said, we're all trying to build ourselves up? There's a way that I think everyone can benefit, but we need to start looking at trade and how we work with each other in a more fair and equitable way. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to interacting with you.